Over the last few weeks, we've been talking about becoming more like Jesus. As we study the Bible, we see a lot of the characters, qualities, personality, just the way Jesus interacted with people and how he trusted in God for everything. And so that's reflective of his trust and dependence on somebody, something, that's the Father in heaven, much greater than himself as far as his understanding of what God's will was, and to be submissive to what he was to do while he was here on the earth. There was a plan. And so Jesus was willing to give himself fully and completely. And that's what we're called to do as well. We often talk about we're trying to be like Jesus, and yet to be like him, we have to understand a little bit of the qualities that he had. So today we want to talk about this idea of being like Jesus. And there's a word that quite often does not show up very often in our more modern translations, and that's the word meekness. And part of the problem with the word meekness is people don't really know what it means. So I think that's one of the reasons it's not talked about so much. Because when you go to basically the world's dictionary, somebody who is meek is somebody who is very weak, very docile, somebody who's very complacent, don't really care, they're not going to stand up, they're going to be walked over, and they don't really ever take a stand with anything, because it's got the idea of that you are not going to get involved and you're not going to stand. And we find out that in the Bible, with the illustrations especially that come up in the Bible, we know that meekness is not weakness. It's not that at all. It's quite different, actually. And so we talk about Jesus being meek, and sometimes we sing songs about, Jesus meek and gentle, the person that certainly has his emotions and his reactions and his ability to interact with people. It's kind of under control. And that's ultimately what meekness is. And so we want to look at that in our own lives, because I think if we understand a little bit more of the detail or the complexity of that in our own lives, how that works, that will help us, to understand exactly what Jesus did and how we are to be like him. So I did throw the word gentle in there just so that we don't get too confused. Meek and gentle is the type of quality that Jesus had that we in this world are trying to live by, just as Jesus was that kind of person in his interaction with others and even with his Father. And so probably the best way for us to understand what this means is maybe to look at examples, look at illustrations and times when this word is used. And again, in the modern translations, quite often the word comes out gentle or humble. And yet some of the older translations uses the word meek. And so in Numbers chapter 12, it describes there Moses in the Old Testament. Now, would anybody describe Moses as somebody who is weak? Well, I don't think any of us would. I mean, even before he really did anything for God's people, he grew up in Pharaoh's kingdom in the palace and was educated in all the ways of that kingdom of Egypt and all the knowledge and wisdom. And, we kind of know from history that the Egyptians were fairly capable people in their understanding, in their communication, even in their sciences and in their construction. And, there's a lot of things that they did very well. And Moses was highly educated, so he was not somebody who was ignorant. He also had a position of power, so he's not a weak man. But he ended up being that person that God had called to lead God's people. So if you remember, when he's about 40 years old, he maybe stepped ahead of what God wanted him to do, and he ended up killing one of the slave drivers. And then he was working for a man named Jethro, married a daughter, and was a shepherd, literally with sheep, for 40 years. So at 80 years old, he comes back to Egypt, after he was called by God, comes back to Egypt to lead the people out of Egypt. And for another 40 years, he led the people. So ultimately, we're talking here we are in Numbers chapter 12 when it comes up, like a guy who's about 90 years old. Now, I don't know if this has ever happened to you when you were 90 years old, but your older brother and sister, okay, these people are 90 anyway. So the older brother and sister, they got an issue. They got an issue with Moses. Well, we don't like the way you're leading, and quite frankly, we don't like the woman you married. You married this, this woman that, is not from around here. She's maybe not one of us. Maybe you never asked us if, I don't know what all the issues were, but they were having some issues with Moses as being the leader. Now think about if you are literally the called leader of God. You're the one doing miracles. You are being led by God. And here these people are coming and challenging. Like, who do you think you are? Do you think you're the only one that God talks to? Do you think you're the only one with leadership qualities? Don't you see that we are a part of this whole thing too? And while we should have a say and we should have a part. And, so I don't know all that was going on with Miriam, who was the older sister, and also with Aaron, who was the priest, right? So, they've got significant leadership roles, but they got an issue with brother. So, you know what Moses does? Well, he would do what everybody does. Say, well, you don't know who I am. I've been called by God, and you shouldn't be talking to me that way, because you know what happens when people challenge God's authority. He strikes them dead, so you just better get in your place. You better go home and pray about it. You better hope that I see God on your behalf, that, you may be able to live another day. You remember Moses saying that? You know what Moses said? Nothing. He didn't say anything. He's like, right, okay. So God intervenes, and God's like, I'll put it in kind of our terms. Hello down there. Hello, I'm up here. Listen. And then God basically says to Moses, to Aaron and Miriam, who do you guys think you are? When I talk to people, sometimes I talk to prophets. And you could almost think about all the people that God's talked to, right? He talked to Adam and Eve. He talked to Noah. He talked to Abraham. He talked to Isaac and Jacob. He's led a lot of people throughout the years. And God says, I've talked to a lot of people, but I haven't talked to anybody like I talked to Moses, because I kind of just tell them from afar. But when I get together with Moses, it's face to face. It's friend to friend. It's like together. Like I show up in Moses' presence to talk to him. Like Moses is really like no other leader that's been so far. And like you're challenging his authority? And so God is the one who intervenes for Moses. So what we ask ourselves, well, what was Moses doing here? Well, and this verse comes up. Verse 3, you probably already read it. And you think, and I know it's a little tricky to understand, because it's like, it's the joke that we always say, but actually really happened perhaps, that, for me to tell you something, I've never really said this before, but I think you need to know that I am the most humblest person I had ever known, right? Well, yeah, generally it doesn't come out that way. But now whether Moses said this or this was a commentary of his life, so let me put it this way. We know, or certainly we believe with certainty, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? Everybody got that? Does everybody kind of believe that for the most part? Well, probably wrote it, at least most of it, at least majority of it. But you remember at the end of Deuteronomy, it kind of says something like, Moses died, and he was buried, and the people mourned for him. Think Moses was writing that? Right? So somebody evidently came along at some point. I had to write a little bit. So perhaps, and most Bibles, this actually is in parentheses or in brackets, right? So maybe that's kind of saying this was inserted by somebody else, not necessarily by Moses. But it's trying to give us this idea that Moses was meek. It's kind of to give us an example of how meek Moses was. The leader of God's people. And here his family members are coming and challenging his authority and who he thinks he is. And he's like, if you got a problem with me, God will take care of it. God will speak. God will judge. God, he's the sovereign one. He's watching over. I don't need to stand up for myself. I don't need to defend myself. I don't need to tell you who I think I am. I'm just going to leave that up to God. So what is meekness then? Meekness is when you have the power to say something or do something, even on your own behalf, to put somebody else in their place, to get justice for your own self, so that you can stand up and be the person that you want to be. You've got the power to do that, and maybe you've got the right to do that, but you say, I don't need to do that. I don't need to do that. I don't need to stand up for myself. I don't need to defend myself. I don't have something to prove. Like, it'll become evident one day, perhaps, but hey, if it doesn't, that's okay. And this is what Moses was doing. This is the context of, Moses was the most meek person in the world, on the earth, the person that's living, And so the idea is, This is a great demonstration of meekness. So how's meekness defined? When you've got the power and you've got the authority and maybe you've got the right to demand your own way or to defend yourself, and you think, I just don't need to do that. I don't need to put you in your place, although I could, and people would think I should, but I'm not going to, because that's not who I am. You think, that's kind of far-fetched, isn't it? I mean, who else would do something like that? Oh, well, thanks for asking. Abraham did something similar to that, didn't he? You remember Abraham and Lot? So Lot was Abraham's nephew, and Lot was somebody, we would call him like a tag-along. I don't even know if Lot was invited to come with Abraham, and they journeyed and all that stuff, and all of Abraham's livestock and his wealth was multiplying on a regular basis, and Lot was just there hanging out. And guess what happened to all of Lot's stuff too? It multiplied too, just because you're living in the same house as Uncle Abe. And here it is, everything's going well. And it's only because God blessed Abraham and Lot was able to benefit from it. And then eventually, they got so big that Lot's shepherds and Abraham's shepherds were not getting along. We got way too many sheep. Where are we going to? There's too much going on. And eventually, Abraham said, well, we just should separate because we're just way too big to be together. And we'll get more done if we're separated. And so, like Abraham is the leader. He's the one called by God. He's the man of covenant. Lot was just there. And again, maybe an uninvited guest. And yet, Abraham says to Lot, there's a really nice city over there, and there's kind of some empty fields over there. You know, there's the big city. There, everything's already go. There, it looks like there's a great place of abundance and a good life and maybe lots of entertainment, and maybe they've even got a winning ball team. You can go to the city, or you can go out there and live in the country, you know. But Lot, I'll tell you what, you choose. If you want to go to the city, I'll go to the country. You choose the country, I'll go to the city. Who does that? I mean, you're the guy in charge. You say, well, I'm choosing first. You get the leftovers. See, Abraham had the right to do that. And we would say, of course, he should have done that. But he didn't. He was willing to say, I'm willing to let you choose. I'm willing to forego my rights and my power and my authority and my promise and my blessing. Yeah, this has all been given to me by God, but you choose. So what is that? That's meekness. It's when you've got power, but you say, I'm not going to exercise my power. I'm going to let you have the benefit. I'm going to let you have the blessing. I'm going to let you have the decision. I'm going to let you have the forgiveness. And if it means that you're going to look good, and maybe I'm not going to look so good, that's okay. And maybe if you get the better and I don't get the, that's okay. You know why? God will take care of it in the end. I can leave even justice to God. You say, really? Would somebody ever do that? Well, there was another man in the Bible. His name was Joseph. His brothers hated him. They wanted to kill him. He was actually in a pit, and he couldn't go anywhere. He's the youngest, probably still a teenager, and they're talking about killing him. And I mean, you can imagine he's fearful of his life. And then instead of getting killed, he got sold to a band of gypsies that are on their way to Egypt. And he ends up in Egypt with no family, no friends, nothing of nothing. He's just there all on his own, right? But eventually God blesses him and he works his way up. And then, you know the story. But the point is, when his brothers came back, and then they finally found out that he was Joseph, their own brother, and then the dad died, then the brothers were very afraid. And what were they? They were fearful of this. Joseph has power. He has authority, and he can put us to death. He can put us in jail. He can take away everything that we have and make us live in poverty the rest of his life. He can get even. And now's the perfect time. And you know what they're thinking in their mind? Exactly what we would think. That's the right thing to do. That's the just thing to do. And who'd blame them? Would anybody here blame Joseph for doing that? After all they did to him? We wouldn't blame him. But he didn't. He said, I have power to do this, and it's just. If I gave you that sentence, even of death, that's just. But he didn't. He said, I'll forgive you. You don't need to worry about me. I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm not seeking vengeance. God's working it out. And that's kind of the famous words. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I've just been trusting him the whole time. So you don't need to worry. God will take care of it. And if there's punishment coming your way, God will dish it out. And it may be a whole lot worse than anything I can dish out, because he's God. I'm going to trust him. But, it doesn't happen very often. Well, yeah, it does actually, doesn't it, in the Old Testament? You remember a guy named David, shepherd boy. And there's a guy named Saul who's the king. And David defeats Goliath. David ends up in Saul's army. But everybody likes David because he's a great, victorious warrior. And it wasn't because David was a great guy or because he was smart or even he was that good with a sling. It was because God was with him. He was doing very well. And Saul hated him. Saul wanted to kill him. Saul's the king. And so David's like, okay, I'll just run away. I'll let Saul do his own thing. He can stay there in Jerusalem. He can be king. I'm going to flee away, and I'll just be out of his hair. He's going to forget about me. Remember Saul? He didn't forget about David. He was so mad at David. He was hunting him down. Like a fugitive that's going, David is going from this country to this province, to that city. And Saul is just like running out, like personally with his army, of course. He didn't send other people. He was like, I want to kill him. Finding David to kill him because David was popular and Saul, his kingdom was falling apart. So David gets the opportunity. David and Saul, one man against another man in a cave. And Saul doesn't even know David's there. Oh, this is the time. What is justice? Can you tell me what justice would be? This guy has, for years, has been pursuing you to kill you. What's the right thing to do? Well, the right thing to do is what David did. He pulled out his dagger, and he snuck up behind King Saul. And you know what he did? Cut a little piece off of his garment, and then he snuck away. And later on, he was able to speak to Saul and say, Saul, like from a distance, of course, like you don't want to be too close with Saul. He's still mad. Saul, you're missing a piece of your garment, and here it is. You see, you were in the cave, and I was right there with you, and I had the knife in my hand, and what did I do? I cut your garment, and you probably think I should have cut your heart, but I didn't. So what is that? That's meekness. Meekness is when you have the power to do something, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the right thing, which is to care for people, to love people, to forgive people, to work with people, to give people another chance. Whatever it is, it's like, and David's point was, I'm not going to take the life of God's anointed. This is God's king. And you know what David's thinking is? If God wants Saul dead, God's big enough to do that. He can take care of that. Whatever God wants. But I don't need to be the one presuming what God wants me to do and go out and take the guy's life. If God wants to strike Saul dead, now I don't know, maybe David prayed that every night. God, may today be the day, take his life, take him out. He's a bad guy. He's not good for the kingdom and he's certainly not good for me. Eliminate, but I don't know. But he's like, I'm not going to do that. Why? Because he was meek. See, the problem between meek and weak is this. When I was a little kid at 4 years old, maybe I did something wrong and my parents were going to discipline me. And, all these things that go through your mind, think, well, I can get even and I can stop this and I can show them. You remember how well that works out when you're 4 years old? Why doesn't that work? That's not meekness. And you may say, well, I submitted. That's not because you were meek. That's because you were weak. You didn't have the power to stand up to them. You didn't have the power to tell them, because they're the ones in control. It's kind of like you being at work. This is kind of the way it would go. You're an employee and your manager may not even be treating you well, right? For you to submit to that is not necessarily meekness, because it's like, well, I can lash out, but then I'll lose my job, and I can go home and tell my wife that I lost my job again. Now I'm unemployed, and now we don't have any money, right? So I submit to him because really I'm in a weak position. He's strong and I'm weak. And if I stand up, bad things are going to happen to me in my job. Well, what is meekness? Meekness is when you're the manager and your employees, maybe the people even 2 or 3 levels under you, and they're not treating you well and they're speaking badly about you, you have the power to discipline them or to fire them. And you decide, I'm not going to exercise my power or my right, even if it's the just thing to do because they're hurting me. I may not do that. That is meekness. Now, there are times where people stand up. You remember Jesus? He was also very meek. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But Jesus was also strong. Who would ever say, well, Jesus was weak. He never stood up to anything. No, Jesus always stood up for the right thing. He just didn't always stand up for himself. And so we see different examples of how this has worked out. And so through some scriptures, we may understand this. When Jesus said, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about, blessed are those who are poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. And then the third one is, blessed are those who are meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed the meek. There's a blessing in that. The blessing is that I can trust God. I don't always have to get my way, and I don't always have to exercise justice, and I don't always have to demand my own rights. Sometimes I can just say, God, I'm going to trust you. You can take care of that. Based on the illustrations that we've already talked about, I can say this works out. Because God, in his wisdom, and in his timing, and in his way, can work it out. And I don't need to say, I've always got to get my way, and I've always got to work it out so that I feel good about it. That I'm the one who got even. Let it be God who can take care of that. The idea is inheriting the earth is saying I'm going to trust in God and I can live in this world at peace. Because I'm not so concerned about what everybody's thinking about me, saying about me, doing to me, all this stuff and how I need to react and respond and get even and all that stuff. I can just say, God, I'm just going to trust you. You'll take care of this. And so this is the idea. Blessed are those who are meek. Now, even in the Old Testament in Proverbs, it talks about that kind of anger. See, here's contrasting different people. One is slow to anger, and one who's able to control his spirit, control his temper, control his disposition, control his feelings, okay? So you've got somebody who's slow to anger and someone who's in self-control. But the person who's slow to anger, in other words, he's able to control his reaction to something, is better or even stronger than a mighty man. We think about that guy. This is the way we see it in the movies, right? When somebody is being put down, or somebody's being abused, or somebody is being taken advantage of, and all of a sudden, maybe it's that person. They rise up, and they're strong, and they get even. And we think, yes, justice has been served. That's what we want. We want the strong person. Well, sometimes that's necessary for a strong person, but generally, what do strong people do? They're trying to get their own way. They're trying to get their own justice. Their feelings have been hurt, and maybe things have happened to them. And certainly there's nothing wrong with justice in the world, right? But when everything is, I need to get vengeance. I need to seek this out personally because my feelings have been hurt, because people have done things towards me. So sometimes it's good just to say, I can let that go, and I will let God take care of that. So the one who's slow to anger is better or stronger than the mighty man, and he who rules the spirit is stronger than him who takes a city. So you can imagine a warrior, he goes in, and he overcomes, he fights, and he wins, he conquers an entire city. You think, what a strong person. And we think today, the people who stand up for themselves, and they fight for their rights, and they're out protesting, and they're out, just rebelling, and they're just out vocal all the time. Wow, were they ever strong? Proverbs is saying, who sometimes a strong person is? The person who says, I feel like doing that, but I know it's not the right thing to do. Not now. Not in this way. Not with that tone. Not with those words. Not with how I'm feeling, because I think it could just be taken way out of control and people can take it the wrong. Maybe I should just be quiet. That's sometimes somebody who's strong, right? Sometimes it's easier to keep your mouth quiet than it is to stand up and start yelling and screaming. You think anybody can stand up and yell and scream when you're mad? This is meekness. So we sometimes call it power under control. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1, as Paul's writing a letter to the Corinthians, he's saying, he's kind of reconsidering and thinking again about who Christ was and how he lived. And Paul's writing this letter to them, and he says, I'm pleading with you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. So he's thinking, how did Jesus treat people? How did Jesus love people? How did Jesus respond to people? And as Paul's writing this letter, he's kind of saying, I could be really strong, I could be domineering, I could, call you out on all these things, but I'm not going to do that. Because Christ wasn't always that way. Sometimes Christ did stand up and tell people the way it was, right? Generally, that was to the religious leaders, not to the people struggling in their faith or to the non-Christians. But Jesus was meek sometimes in dealing with people. He could have said something very strong, and he thinks, I'm just going to let it go. I'm going to teach again. I'm going to have to go through this lesson again. I'm going to have to show through my example in the future. There's more opportunities. And so Jesus was not always as strong or forthcoming, as maybe we expected him to be. I think that's something that maybe the disciples were really concerned about. It's like, well, he says he's the Messiah, but he doesn't seem to be really, rolling everybody down. He's not like fighting everybody. He seems pretty calm. He seems pretty gentle. He seems kind. He almost seems like he's forgiving. Doesn't seem like a big old conquering warrior. Where is he? Where is this Messiah? So Paul's saying, I want to be like Christ. When I write this letter, when I talk to you. By the way, I'm not getting emotional, just my throat's drying out a little bit. If you see the tears coming, it's just because the throat's drying up too much. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so this is the verse which we see about Jesus. And there's many times where Jesus was meek. But this is one illustration where it says he was meek. Again, depending on translation, sometimes it says he's gentle or humble, riding on the donkey. But when Jesus came into the town, this is just before he was crucified, he's coming into town to say, I am the Messiah. I am the king. I'm the one you've been waiting for. But the problem, he's riding on the wrong animal. Because if he's going to be the king, he should be riding on a stallion. He should have a big sword by his side. He should have maybe a big bronze helmet on. And he should say, we are ready to conquer the world. But Jesus rides into town on a donkey, and it says it's a colt, which means a donkey that's never been ridden. So again, you have to think that in your mind. Here's an animal. Guess what this animal does not have? Self-control, right? I don't know if you've ever tried riding a horse that's never been ridden. It doesn't work out very well. I've seen the shows, right? It takes a while to break the spirit of an animal so that you can ride on it. And that's something, I think the lesson is not for this donkey. It's for some of us who maybe sometimes are like a donkey, right? Spirit's got to be broken. We've got to say, no, I can submit to this. I can submit to God's will. I can allow this to carry on. And one day, justice will be served, but I don't have to be the one doing it. So Jesus is coming into town not as a conquering king, but as a humble, serving Messiah. Come to save the world, not just to save Jerusalem. It's not just for the Jews. He's come to save everybody. To save them from what? Well, there's only one thing that they wanted. We want to be saved from Rome. That's it. Saved from Rome is all that really matters. And so you can imagine somebody putting up their hand saying, so you're saying if we're saved from Rome and we end up going to hell, is that okay? Yeah, I think that's good. Let's just be saved from Rome. We can live for another 20 or 30 years where we are the people of the world, just like it was in David's, and then for the rest of eternity, we'll just go to hell. Does anybody think that sounds like a good idea? So Jesus says, I'm not here to conquer Rome. Well, why did you come? I'm here to conquer your heart. It's you I want, not Rome. I want to change you. I don't want to change the political system. I want to change the kingdom of God. It's inside of you. It's something that cannot be seen or touched, but it's something that can be witnessed in our own lives. A transformed heart, a transformed life is why Jesus came. That's much harder to conquer than some political organization or some king sitting on a throne or even some out of touch conquering military leader even in our world. Jesus came humbly. So what does this mean? Jesus came in meekness because he could have decided he's coming in on the big stallion. I mean, think about it this way. Like Jesus could have come, he really could have come into Jerusalem way back then in a tank. Now everybody would be like, what is that? Never seen that before. But it's like, there's no way anybody can, but I mean, he could have come any way he wanted. Because he had the power. He was the king. He was the one who was over everyone. But he said, I can be the servant of everyone. But no, you're the king over everyone. It doesn't matter. I have the power to do what I want. And you know what I want to do? I want to serve you. I want to love you. I want to care for you. I want to save you. What? You're the king. You're supposed to save yourself. Like when you're in power, you're to make yourself look good. Everybody to honor you and worship you and look up to you. He's saying, no, I've come to serve. And you know what the disciples were thinking. Well, no one's going to look up to you. No one's going to honor you. No one's going to worship you. We don't hold the servant in a high regard. So you know what Jesus was? He was meek. So that's what we've been called to do. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 23, when they hurled their hurling their insults at Christ, you could just imagine that was going on and on while he was being tried and while he was being mocked, basically all night long at the high priest's house. They hurled their insults at him. He did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. And we know that Jesus didn't have to do that. He could have stood up. He could have just said the word. And see, when Jesus was arrested, he didn't even say anything. But when he did say something. When the people came and said, who are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for Jesus. And when he said, I am he, that's all he said, I am he, or maybe he just said, I am. And what happened? All the people fell down. Either they lost their balance, maybe they fainted, maybe they were just in so much awe that they fell down. But Jesus' next word could have been, die. That's all he had to say. And they all would have been dead. And this night, they all could have been dead. Now, if they all died that night, quickly, and maybe the high priest would have been there and he didn't die, but he looks around and like everybody else is dead. Do you think he would have carried on with the trial? I don't think so. He'd be like, what's going on? He didn't do that. He could have. On the cross, he said, I could call down legions of angels, but he didn't. Why? He had power to do that, but he said, I'm not going to exercise my power. So that's what meekness is. When you have the power, you have the ability, and you feel like you've got the right to do this, and you say, I'm not going to do it because it's not about me. It's about you. So as we close, think about, and I know we've read this a lot, but think about what this is saying. With the word meekness, in some of the older translations, the old King James uses the word meek. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. Think about that. What's Jesus saying? Come and learn from me because I am weak. Well, why am I going to go to Jesus? Because, I know something. When you're weak, you can't help me. You don't have the understanding, you don't have the knowledge, and you don't have the strength to help me. Right? It's not going to work. If Jesus is weak, I'm weak. I don't need another weak person. I need a strong person. What's Jesus saying? I am Meek. What does meek mean? Meek means Jesus is strong. He's got the power. But I don't want to go to Jesus because he's got the power. Like he's the perfect one. He's got the power of God. And I don't live anywhere near up to his standard. So I'm going to go to him and I'm going to say, I need you. And he's going to say, I have all power and I don't care. You don't deserve my help. You have failed too often. Well, that's not meek either, is it? That's strong, but not meek. So he's not weak and he's not too strong to care. He's meek, which means he has the power, and we come to him and he says, but I do care about you. I am thinking about you. I'm not going to exercise my authority for me. I'm doing it for you. I didn't come to the world for me. I came for you. So if he's meek, we can come to him, not fearing that he's going to reject us, because that's not who he is. Not fearing he can't help us because he's too weak. That's not who he is. He's got the power and he's got the love because he's meek. So there's the idea that he is meek and lowly in heart. And when we go to him, guess what? We find rest. We find help. We find that he says, yes, you've got a burden to bear, and getting in this yoke means I'm going to walk with you. We're going to do this together. I'm going to carry this. We're going to be pulling this together. We're going to be walking side by side. You're going to find strength in me because I'm here to help. So this is great comfort to us that he's just not helpful, but he's strong enough to walk with us, to be more than helpful, to actually be a blessing to us. And he's loving enough that he actually cares. So this is the idea that we can come to Christ knowing that he is meek, lowly in heart. And when we come to him, that's where we find rest for our souls, from our problems, from our worries, from our struggles, from our temptations, from the things that overcome us and overpower us, from our discouragement, from our weakness, from our sin. We come to Christ. He's there to help us. If today you need to come to Christ and make that decision to be a follower, to be a disciple, the invitation is always there for people to say, I'm ready today to walk with Christ because he loves me, he cares for me, and he's got the power to save my soul. If we can encourage you and bless you today, we'll stand, we'll sing this song, and let us know how we can be an encouragement to you today.